The Galactic Institute of Biological Excellence had been the undisputed authority on genetic superiority for over 3 millennia, which was impressive, considering most academic institutions collapsed under the weight of their own pretentiousness long before reaching their first century. Perched on the crystalline peaks of Helix Prime, the Institute's towers spiraled into the purple sky like monuments to intellectual vanity, each one dedicated to celebrating the galaxy's most evolutionarily advanced species. Professor Zyxandra had built her entire career on the premise that genetic perfection could be measured, quantified, and ranked with mathematical precision. The crystalline scholar stood nearly 12 feet tall, her translucent body refracting light in patterns that supposedly indicated superior neural processing. Her research had established the definitive hierarchy of galactic species, crystallines at the apex of evolution, followed by the energy beings of Proxima, then various adequately developed biological forms, and finally the unfortunate creatures still burdened with primitive carbon-based chemistry. Her assistant, Bliptalk, was a perfect example of species trying their best with limited genetic material. The small mollusk researcher had joined the institute despite being classified as Tier 7, moderately evolved with commendable effort. His enthusiasm made up for what nature had failed to provide in the way of superior genetics. Professor Bliptalk bubbled excitedly, his eye stalks waving with nervous energy. The applications for this year's Tournament of Species have exceeded all previous records. We have contestants from 47 different star systems. The Tournament of Species was the Institute's crown jewel, an annual celebration where the galaxy's most genetically gifted beings competed across multiple categories to demonstrate their evolutionary superiority. Physical prowess, cognitive excellence, social sophistication, and genetic stability were all measured with the kind of scientific rigor usually reserved for calculating hyperspace navigation routes. Excellent, Zyxandra replied, her crystalline form chiming softly as she moved. And I trust the screening process has eliminated any obviously inferior applicants. Well, mostly. Though there is one rather unusual application that arrived this morning. Zyxandra's light patterns shifted to indicate mild irritation. Define unusual, Bliptalk. The mollusk hesitated, his tentacles twisting with embarrassment. The applicant claims to be from a species called human, originating from a planet called Terra. Neither appears in our galactic database. Obviously fraudulent, then. Rejected immediately. That's what I thought, but the application came with a genetic sample, and our preliminary scanners produced some rather interesting results. Zyxandra turned her attention fully to her assistant, which involved redirecting several of her internal light sources for maximum intimidation effect. Interesting how? The scanner displayed an error message. Several error messages, actually. It seems unable to properly classify the genetic material. In 3,000 years of operation, the Institute's genetic scanners had never encountered a sample they couldn't classify. The quantum biological analyzers were capable of processing DNA from any known life form in the galaxy, mapping evolutionary history, and predicting future adaptive potential with 99.7% accuracy. Show me, Zyxandra commanded. Bliptalk activated the holographic display, revealing the preliminary scan results. Where normally there would be a neat classification chart showing evolutionary markers, genetic stability ratings, and species hierarchy placement. Instead, there was a cascade of error messages that made no scientific sense. Genetic code violates fundamental thermodynamics. Warning: evolutionary path contains logical gray matter. Impossibilities error. Species classification impossible. Consult xenobiology emergency protocols. Zyxandra studied the readout with growing fascination. This is clearly the result of genetic tampering or artificial enhancement. Some lower-tier species attempting to cheat their way into the tournament by submitting fabricated samples. That was my assumption as well, Professor. But the molecular structure appears completely natural. No artificial modifications detected. Then the sample is contaminated or the subject is deceased. Living organisms simply cannot possess genetic markers this contradictory. Zixandra made her decision with the confidence of someone who had never encountered a problem that couldn't be solved with superior intellect. Invite this human to the institute. We'll expose this fraud personally and use it as an educational opportunity for our students. 3 days later, Nix Chen arrived at the institute aboard what could generously be described as a spacecraft and more accurately as a collection of spare parts held together by determination and prayer. The small vessel limped through the institute's defensive perimeter with the grace of a wounded asteroid, trailing what appeared to be actual smoke from its primitive chemical engines. Nix herself was disappointingly ordinary by galactic standards. She stood roughly 6 feet tall, possessed the standard bilateral symmetry common to countless species, and moved with the unremarkable efficiency of someone who had better things to do than impress academics. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and she wore clothing that looked suspiciously like it had been designed for actual work rather than aesthetic purposes. "Good morning," she said cheerfully, approaching the reception desk where Bliptalk waited with barely contained scientific curiosity. "I'm here for the tournament thing. Hope I'm not too early." "Not at all, Miss Chen. Professor Zixandra is eager to meet you. Though I must ask, how did you learn about our tournament? We don't typically receive applications from unregistered species." Nix shrugged, adjusting a worn backpack that looked like it had seen several decades of hard use. "Found your pamphlet at a rest stop near the vegan border. Figured it sounded educational. Plus, I've never been to this part of the galaxy before." She followed Bliptalk through corridors lined with holographic displays showcasing the galaxy's most evolutionarily advanced beings. Crystalline scholars floated past in contemplative silence, while energy beings flickered through advanced mathematical concepts. The institute practically hummed with intellectual superiority. "If you don't mind me asking," Bliptalk said as they walked, "what exactly is your species' evolutionary specialty? Every race has developed particular advantages over time." "Oh, we're pretty good at not dying," Nix replied matter-of-factly. "Been doing it for about 200,000 years now." Before Bliptalk could process this response, they arrived at Professor Zixandra's laboratory. The crystalline scholar had prepared the Institute's most advanced genetic analysis equipment for what she anticipated would be a brief but educational demonstration of scientific fraud. "Miss Chen," Zixandra announced, her crystalline form resonating with academic authority, "welcome to the Galactic Institute of Biological Excellence. I trust you understand that our tournament maintains the highest standards of genetic verification." "Sure thing," Nix replied, setting her backpack down and producing what appeared to be a thermos and a sandwich wrapped in some sort of primitive packaging material. "Mind if I eat while we do this?" "Missed breakfast." Without waiting for permission, she unwrapped her sandwich and took a bite. Several graduate students observing the proceedings exchanged shocked glances. No one ate during genetic analysis. It simply wasn't done. "Please step into the scanner." "Array," Zixandra instructed, activating the most sophisticated genetic analysis system in known space. The quantum biological scanners hummed to life, directing focused energy beams at Nix from multiple angles. Advanced sensors analyzed cellular structure, mapped neural pathways, and traced evolutionary markers back through millions of years of development. The whole process should have taken roughly 30 seconds to produce a complete genetic profile. Instead, alarm klaxons began sounding throughout the laboratory. "Critical error. Subject's genetic code violates thermodynamics. Warning, evolutionary history contains paradoxical elements. Emergency protocol activated. Impossible life form detected." Zixandra stared at the displays in growing confusion while Nix continued eating her sandwich with apparent unconcern. "There must be some interference with the equipment." "Bliptalk, run a full diagnostic." "All systems showing optimal performance, Professor. No mechanical failures detected." The scanner tried again, this time using deeper analysis protocols reserved for the most complex genetic structures. The results were even more alarming. "DNA analysis complete. Subject should be biologically extinct. Evolutionary path assessment. Impossible survival sequence detected. Genetic stability rating. Error, mathematics insufficient." Is everything all right? Nix asked, noticing the increasingly frantic activity around the laboratory. Your machine seems upset about something. The scanner is indicating that your genetic structure island. Impossible. Zixandra admitted, her usual confidence beginning to waver. Yeah, I get that a lot. You should see what happens when I try to buy life insurance. Dr. Veltaris, the Institute's chief xenobiologist, arrived within minutes of the emergency alert, the elderly energy being flickered with the accumulated wisdom of 15 centuries studying galactic biology. She had personally classified over 2,000 species, considered herself an expert on evolutionary impossibilities. What seems to be the problem? She asked, her energy patterns pulsing with professional concern. Our scanner cannot properly classify this being's genetic structure, Zixandra explained. The readings suggest evolutionary adaptations that violate basic biological principles. Dr. Veltaris focused her attention on Nix, who had finished her sandwich and was now drinking from her thermos while watching the proceedings with obvious amusement. May I ask what planet you evolved on, Miss Chen? Earth. Though most folks call it Terra these days. Nice little blue and green planet, about 26,000 light-years from here. And what is Earth's environmental classification? Oh, you know, the usual. Ice ages, supervolcanoes, asteroid impacts, gamma-ray bursts, magnetic pole reversals, continental drift, mass extinctions every few million years. Standard death world stuff. The laboratory fell silent except for the continued alarming from the genetic scanners. Death world? Dr. Veltaris repeated faintly. Class 12. Last time I checked. Though that was before the whole nuclear weapons phase, so might be higher now. Class 12 was the highest danger classification in galactic taxonomy. Planets rated Class 12 were considered unsuitable for any form of life more complex than extremophile bacteria. The idea that a sentient species could evolve on such a world was theoretically impossible. That would explain the contradictory genetic markers, Dr. Veltaris mused, her energy patterns shifting to indicate deep thought. If your species evolved under constant extinction pressure, you would have developed adaptive mechanisms that our scanners interpret as impossible. We prefer to think of it as versatile, Nix said cheerfully. Dr. Veltaris activated her personal analysis equipment, devices so advanced they made the Institute's scanners look like primitive counting machines. The results appeared on quantum displays that hurt to look at directly. Fascinating. Your species has simultaneously developed adaptations for Arctic survival, desert endurance, high-altitude functionality, underwater capability, and resistance to radiation, toxins, and biological pathogens. Any one of these should have prevented the others from evolving. Yeah, evolution got a bit creative with us. Turns out when everything is trying to kill you all the time, you get pretty good at not letting it. Professor Zixandra was studying the readouts with growing horror. According to every measure of genetic superiority the Institute had developed, humans should rank somewhere near the bottom of galactic evolution. Their DNA was a chaotic mess of contradictory adaptations, their cellular structure was inefficient, and their neural architecture looked like it had been designed by committee. Yet somehow, they had survived on a planet that should have killed them millions of times over. Miss Chen, Zixandra said slowly, given these unique evolutionary circumstances, you understand that your species cannot be properly classified within our standard hierarchy. Sure, no problem. I'm just here for the learning experience anyway. Oh, and I brought snacks for everyone. Nix reached into her backpack and produced a collection of wrapped food items. Trail mix, energy bars, some fruit from Earth. Figured you might get hungry. The concept of sharing food during scientific procedures was so foreign that several graduate students actually gasped. In civilized galactic society, nutritional intake was carefully regulated and consumed in designated periods. The idea of casual snacking was barbaric, yet something about Nix's offer seemed to cut through millennia of academic protocol. Bliptalk tentatively accepted a piece of fruit, examined it curiously, then took a small bite. His eye stalks widened with surprise. This island. Actually quite pleasant. What do you call this? Apple. We grow them pretty much everywhere on Earth. Good source of fiber and vitamins. Within minutes, half the laboratory staff was sampling human food while discussing the implications of Nix's genetic impossibility. The formal atmosphere of scientific investigation had somehow transformed into something resembling a social gathering. Professor, Dr. Valteris said quietly, "If we proceed with the tournament, this human will likely dominate every category." Impossible. She's genetically inferior by every measure we've established. That's exactly the point. Our measures were developed by species that evolved in stable, predictable environments. We've been selecting for genetic optimization, not genetic resilience. Miss Chen's species has been selected by apocalypse for 200,000 years. The tournament of species proceeded despite Zixandra's growing reservations. Galactic law required that all registered applicants be allowed to compete, and Nix had technically qualified by surviving the genetic screening process. The physical trials came first. Representatives from 47 different species gathered in the Institute's vast competition arena, each confident in their evolutionary advantages. The crystallines expected to dominate with their perfect geometric efficiency. The energy beings anticipated victory through their transcendence of physical limitations. Various biological species prepared to showcase their specialized adaptations. Nix showed up wearing what appeared to be primitive athletic clothing and carrying a water bottle. The endurance trial required competitors to maintain peak performance for 6 standard hours. Within the first hour, half the contestants had withdrawn. By hour 3, only the most evolutionarily advanced beings remained active. Nix was still going strong in hour 5, when she pulled out her trail mix and offered some to a struggling crystalline competitor. "Thanks," the being managed between labored resonances. "But our species doesn't consume organic matter." "Oh, right. How about some encouragement then?" "You're doing great." Almost there. The concept of encouraging competitors was so alien that the judges had to consult the rulebook. There was nothing prohibiting supportive behavior, largely because no one had ever considered the possibility. The cognitive trials were equally revealing. Designed to test problem solving, pattern recognition, and logical reasoning, the challenges had been carefully crafted to showcase the intellectual superiority of the galaxy's most evolved species. Nix approached each problem with what could charitably be described as creative thinking and more accurately as controlled chaos. Where other species applied sophisticated logical frameworks, she used intuition. Where they employed advanced mathematical concepts, she relied on trial and error. Where they demonstrated intellectual elegance, she showed practical persistence. She solved every problem correctly, usually in half the allocated time. "Miss Chen," one of the judges asked after she had completed a particularly complex spatial reasoning challenge, "could you explain your methodology?" "Sure. I figured if I was a tesseract trying to hide in 4-dimensional space, where would I go? Turns out, behind the other tesseract. They're social creatures, apparently." The judge stared at her. "Tesseracts are mathematical constructs. They don't have social behaviors. Maybe not where you come from." The social compatibility trials were designed to test diplomatic skills, cultural sensitivity, and cooperative behavior. Representatives from different species were required to work together to solve complex scenarios involving interstellar trade disputes, colonial management, and resource allocation. Most teams spent hours debating optimal strategies, with each species insisting their evolutionary advantages made them natural leaders. Arguments broke out over genetic hierarchies, intellectual superiority, and cultural refinement. Nix's team finished first by the simple expedient of asking everyone what they were good at and assigning tasks accordingly. "But you didn't establish proper authority structures," one judge protested. "How did you maintain control without asserting genetic dominance?" "Why would I want to control anyone? They're all way smarter than me at their specialties. I just made sure everyone had what they needed to do their job." As the tournament progressed, a disturbing pattern emerged. The human wasn't winning through superior genetics or evolutionary advancement. She was winning by treating every challenge as a problem to be solved, rather than an opportunity to demonstrate superiority. When faced with environmental hazards, she adapted. When confronted with cognitive puzzles, she experimented. When required to work with others, she cooperated. It was the most primitively effective strategy anyone had ever witnessed. The closing ceremony was held in the Institute's Grand Amphitheater, where representatives from across the galaxy had gathered to witness the celebration of genetic excellence. Professor Zixandra stood at the podium, her crystalline form reflecting the ceremonial lights as she prepared to announce the tournament results. "Ladies, gentlemen, and energy patterns," she began, her voice carrying the weight of 3 millennia of academic tradition. "This year's Tournament of Species has produced the most educational results in our Institute's history." The audience murmured with anticipation. This was the moment when genetic superiority would be officially recognized and properly ranked. The winner of this year's tournament, by a margin so significant that our statisticians are still calculating the exact figures, is Miss Nix Chen of the human species from planet Terra. Polite applause filled the amphitheater, though it was tinged with confusion. Most attendees had never heard of humans and assumed they must represent some previously unknown branch of advanced evolution. "Miss Chen," Zixandra continued, "according to our analysis, your species possesses genetic markers that should have resulted in extinction approximately 197,000 years ago. Your DNA contains adaptations that are mutually exclusive. Your evolutionary path violates several well-established principles of biological development. By every measure of genetic advancement we have developed, your species should not exist." Nick stepped up to the podium, still carrying her backpack and looking slightly embarrassed by the attention. "Yet here you are," Zixandra concluded, "having outperformed representatives from 46 of the galaxy's most evolutionarily advanced species. Would you care to explain this paradox?" Nix looked out at the audience of crystalline scholars, energy beings, and various biological entities that represented the pinnacle of galactic evolution. "Well," she said thoughtfully, "I think maybe you've been optimizing for the wrong things. You've all gotten really good at being perfect for specific environments and situations. That's great if your environment never changes." She paused, considering her words carefully. "But our planet never stopped trying to kill us. So we got good at surviving things we weren't supposed to survive. Turns out, when you spend enough time being not quite good enough at everything, you eventually get pretty decent at figuring stuff out." The audience sat in contemplative silence, processing the implications. "Also," Nix added with a grin, "we brought snacks. That helps a lot." She politely declined the trophy, mentioning that she was actually just one of 12 humans from a small colony ship and probably not even the smartest one. The Institute's most prestigious award for genetic superiority was being turned down by someone who considered herself average. As the ceremony concluded and the various species began departing, Professor Zixandra found herself reconsidering 3,000 years of evolutionary theory. The most sophisticated institution in the galaxy, dedicated to celebrating genetic perfection, had just been humbled by a species that succeeded through sheer stubborn refusal to give up. The irony was perfect in its completeness. The galaxy's most advanced genetic scientists had spent millennia optimizing for superiority, only to discover that the ultimate evolutionary advantage was the ability to be inferior at everything and still somehow make it work. Nix Chen disappeared back into the cosmos aboard her improbable spacecraft, leaving behind a trail of academic papers, revised theories, and the uncomfortable realization that sometimes the best way to win at evolution is to be too stubborn to lose. The Institute's scanners still couldn't properly classify human genetics. They had simply updated their error message to read, "Species, genetically impossible but functionally superior." It was, Professor Zixandra reflected, probably the most accurate classification they had ever made.